our session today. We've got a nice group online today. So generally we like to try and keep these sessions pretty interactive. So yeah, we welcome everybody to use the chat function, but we've got the ability to take you off mic and converse directly with Taz as well today. But anyway, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kathy. I'm the Partnerships Manager here at the Tourism Industry Council of South Australia. Welcome, some great familiar faces there, Elise and Kate, Michelle, Julie, Anthony. Great to see you guys on the call, on the session today. We undertake this In Conversation series monthly, really to keep our community engaged and informed and educated on key topics that are evolving. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, being Taz, but like I said, if we could just keep the microphones on mute, we'll use the chat function to field any questions, but we really do encourage questions. This is, you're only going to get out of it what you put into it. So use this opportunity to ask any questions to Taz as you like, and because we've got a nice sized group, we can definitely take you off mic to allow you to converse directly. We'll also be recording this session, so it's an ongoing resource for our members today. Excuse me. Before we jump into things today, though, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the land, which I'm hosting today's session on today, paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. Today, our guest speaker is Tasman Wiley from Wallmans Lawyers. Wallmans Lawyers is a valued partner of TIC SA and has been a resource to our members for education and advice for many years now. Taz is the senior associate and is part of the firm's cyber security and data protection team. Taz will be talking on the importance of cyber data protection regulations, that world that is really unfolding. So thank you, Taz, for joining us today. I'll let you have a quick shout out, Taz.
No worries. No, thank you for having me. Excited to be here. I appreciate everyone coming along for cyber security, one of the more sexy topics, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is. It's not sexy, but it's essential, isn't it?
Absolutely.
TIC SA over the past this year, we've really started to focus on cyber because we know it's a key issue about awareness to our industry, education, and action. We took the perspective initially from insurance, and today we're shifting that to a legal insight with Taz, your expertise on the call. What we do know about cyber security, the landscape is moving fast, and it's a risk management that's a necessity as new threats are always unfolding. And with this in mind, like, cyber is now recognised as the top global risk that businesses face. And I'm sure you see this, Taz, how it's really evolved, particularly probably now to being a day-to-day part of your focus in your role.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, I mean, just I was beforehand to do these sort of things, just looking for a little bit of data to sort of back it up. I suppose I just jumped on the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, who is the sort of the regulatory authority in this space. There is some others which we might touch upon, but just for context, between July to December 2021, there was 464, I call them data breach incidents notifications to the office. So these are sort of notifiable ones we get into members. So to give some context, you're probably getting sort of 400 to 500 of these, per 6 months, which gives you a little context to sort of the series or the extent of which this is occurring. So it is a daily occurrence.
And it's really, as business owners now, Taz, really shifting our awareness. When we initially thought security in running a business, it was probably a different focus that we looked at security, and now looking at that security with online and cyber and data and protecting our data, because all of our business operations are heavily involved with technology. To kick us off, Taz, like, Can you tell us what cyber security and data protection is, and from your perspective, why it's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about cybersecurity and data protection, it's covering up like a number of different matters. A lot of people, I think, supposed to think about it in the sense of, firewalls and passwords and servers and all this sort of the IT technicality, which it is. That's a huge component of it. And I suppose, particularly from my role and what I do, I look more from an organisational level and a compliance level as to, all right, what are we meant to be doing and what are our obligations around privacy protection? So really, from an organisation's perspective, it goes, well, you've got obligations upon you to your customers, to your employees, to your suppliers, to protect the information that they provide to you. And I was looking at it, and it's the big piece of legislation, which we'll probably talk about today, is the Privacy Act. I was reading sort of the preamble to that act, as lawyers want to do, to read legislation, the preambles. It's exciting stuff. But it talks about Australia's obligations under the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And I suppose that's where that's coming from, is it's discussing human rights obligations with respect to the people's protection of their data and privacy. And that's where increasingly it's becoming sort of a bigger issue. So I suppose that's why I sense that we sort of consider it really is an important issue. And one which also from a commercial and business perspective is that if it can be quite embarrassing when organisations do have to notify their clients, customers, suppliers that something has gone wrong, and undermines, I suppose, a lot of faith which people have in it. And particularly, this day and age, we're all a little bit more sensitive about what happens to our data and information because we're becoming so much more aware of it. So back to, I suppose, what we tend to sort of talk about with respect to when we talk about cybersecurity and data protection comes to sort of, from an organisation perspective, what are your policies, processes, procedures, and obligations under sort of compliance and rules, and how we go about it, which I'm sure we'll dig into a little bit further as we go along.
Absolutely. So let's strip this back to a bit of basics, Taz. I'm sitting here with my operator hat on going, well, what data have I got that's important of others? And really understanding the importance of what we probably take maybe a little bit for granted or a bit complacent about. What data are we talking about? Are we talking about email addresses and phone numbers? And then obviously moving on to perhaps if I'm doing online transactions for someone making a booking to my Kathy's canoe tours or something like that. And so what sort of data are we talking about in a real simplistic term?
Yeah, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. Is in the most basic sense, and for the most sort of simple, small, sole operator business, it is people's names, dates of birth, email addresses, phone number, all those sorts of things, which can sometimes seem relatively minor, or looking at that's information that's out there, but not necessarily. And we'll get to in a moment is sort of how that data can sometimes be used by would-be hackers and so forth. It's that simple stuff. But then we can get to, if you do have like an online, portal and, things like passwords. And then we get to this a little bit more, the more serious side, things like credit card payment information, details, addresses, all those sorts of things. I don't think it's probably relevant for this audience, but if you're looking in the medical sphere, your local GP practice and those types of things, what do they have? Whether it's Medicare numbers and all the rest, some of this information is incredibly powerful, either in what can and can't be done with it. But even the simple stuff, a lot of people treat it really seriously.
I think it's really important that I think most people, if they're doing some sort of online transactions and would say, credit card details, but also understanding that minor information you described, names, email addresses, how that is of value to would-be cyber criminals these days. And you have obligations as a business on how you should be managing this information. So sort of shifting down that line, Taz, what are the regulatory obligations to businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. So
they should be aware of, and how do they apply that?
Yeah, so the first one we've already mentioned is the Privacy Act. This is sort of, I suppose, the Bible or the starting point with respect to all of this sort of this discussion, I suppose I'll quickly touch upon, because the Privacy Act isn't applicable to everyone. And I think there probably some people in this audience who would be required to comply, and some people who aren't necessarily required to comply. So in simple terms, you're required to comply with the Privacy Act, which I get to sort of the basic, what that actually means, is if you're an organisation which basically receives revenue over $3 million per year, you're a government authority, and then there are some other catch-alls, so particularly like medical businesses and so forth, who receive certain particular data will then be required to comply. What I also know is what I'm seeing increasingly more often, and this is where some of the smaller businesses start to get captured, is contractual obligations to comply. Is if you get a government contract to provide some supply to the government, they're likely going to have a provision which says in there, you as one of our suppliers need to be complying with this. But also we're seeing, non-government organisations, some of the bigger, tourism operators might be out there saying for our smaller suppliers, you might receive our information and therefore we're going to require of you as to what you can and can't do with that. So what does that really mean? Well, it comes down to what we call the 12 Australian privacy or policy principles. I won't list through all 12 because we'll be here for a while, but essentially these are 12 standards which you're required to meet, which go into things like, well, how you're meant to treat people's information, how if you have someone's information, can or can't you have it? Do you need to delete it? What you can and can't do with it? And then things like cybersecurity, what are your obligations with respect to, your firewalls and, your password protections and all those types of things. So that's sort of mainly what the Privacy Act carries or deals with. We then get into some smaller bits of legislation. So again, we talked about payment details in a moment. It's one of those, I'm not sure everyone is aware of, but there's the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which is essentially a standard which any business which receives payment by card, you're required to meet those obligations. Now, most of that would probably be handled by your portal payment systems. But again, it's one thing you should be aware of as a business is that how you treat people's that information, particularly, I did the other day, called up, I think, my optometrist and said, oh, can I pay this bill over the phone? And they took my credit card details over the phone. Well, how are they meant to actually, if you're going to do that, how is that meant to be treated? What happens with that information? Hopefully just gets straight entered into the FBOS machine and nothing further. But, these sorts of things. And then we can go carry forward. We've got things like the Surveillance Devices Act, which is like, if you're going to have a camera up on your premises, well, can you do that? And what are your obligations around the footage that you take? Or if, as today, this session is being recorded, do we need everyone's permission? All those types of things, because, this conversation could carry personal information, all these sorts of things. So there is cybersecurity elements to all of this.
And I think it might be important for us to share some of those resources with our members. So perhaps post this call, we do send out an email to all participants with obviously a link to the recording. I might grab from you, if possible, a link to those resources you shared, because that could be beneficial resource to everybody on the call there.
Yeah.
So talking cyber breaches, and the expert, you've probably managed this space with a number of your clients. What's some examples? Let's put this into real life perspective for our business owners. What's some examples of breaches that companies are facing? Yeah. Let's make this really real. How real is this? Because like I said at the beginning, it's the top global risk to businesses we're facing. And I even know from a personal perspective, I've had my information compromised. You probably don't take it seriously enough until you've been stung. And we're really, making this a focus. So you guys are on the front foot because we don't want anybody to get stung. So let's put this into real life perspective, Taz, for us. What are some of these examples?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's just funny you just say that, is that, you've been caught up. I must admit, I'm waiting to hear whether I've been caught up in one at the moment. The Law Society of South Australia, which, don't worry, anyone in this audience, they're sort of the lawyers union. So it's me that's in the gun, have just had a cyber hack, and we're hearing at the moment. So they keep on giving us updates as to how it's progressing. So I'm waiting to hear whether my details are being sort of found out by the Law Society. Not that there's anything too exciting in what they've got, but it's hitting everyone. I mean, I don't know how that hack's occurred, so I'm waiting to hear on that as well. To give some basic examples as to how this sort of thing can happen, and I'll just grab my little report on examples of the types and percentages, and then I might just run through a couple of sort of the bigger, more juicier sort of global examples, which might be of interest to people.
I think that would be great perspective for us, Taz, to share. Thank you.
Yeah. So just for the basic or the boring stats of those sort of the last sort of 6 months of data breaches, 55% have happened by malicious or criminal attack. So that's essentially the traditional sense of someone sat at the computer and sort of hacked firewalls, that type of thing, what we might see from Hollywood movies that, you know, we think about like what a data hack or something like might look like. 4% are system faults. Not quite sure, again, that could be quite a variety of different things. But the other part, 41% is human error. So that 41% is things like, I took my laptop home with me and accidentally left it on the train, which is a cyber incident because that's got all of my clients' information on. It can actually, you know, I must say I haven't personally done that, but I didn't say that. It's got huge amounts of information. And if someone picks that up, now obviously my computer would be password protected. Hopefully everyone's work computers are, but not always. And what could be done with that? So that, an example, human error could be something like, I send an email to the wrong person. So I've got, you know, we've all probably done it, is, you know, you start to type an email and you've got, you know, two people with the same name, you send it to the wrong one. Well, if that email is carrying some very sensitive information, well, that's a data incident, it's a breach. So this is where we talk about sort of the human error side of things, and that is making up a significant portion, but also it's one of the most controllable elements. So let's just give us some background. Getting into, so I suppose, some examples. I sort of went online, had a bit of a check as what are the bigger ones happening at the moment. I'm not sure if everyone recalls the Sony 2015 data hack. This is where Sony studios, who, you know, produce lots of movies, Spider-Man and a whole bunch of other things were hacked, and they had whole scripts to films released onto the internet. I think potentially an entire film, so essentially the file was taken, as well as I think quite a lot of embarrassing emails where they're all sort of criticizing each other and, you know, saying some rather outrageous stuff, which is probably, you know, there's shop talk in all businesses, but I think some of those things you don't want ever getting out. So just the background as to sort of how that one occurred. Essentially, I'll just bring it up quickly, a number of people within the organizations, including the CEO, received a fake Apple ID verification email. So basically, someone mocked up a fake email which said, can you please just verify your Apple ID by clicking on this link? Essentially, a phishing attack is the term used. That I'm sure most of you, and we're all getting a lot more sophisticated in knowing what these ones are. So a whole bunch of senior executives from Sony clicked on this link. And after attaining their Apple IDs, and this is the interesting thing, is that they didn't get so via this link, didn't get the login details for Sony. What they got was their Apple IDs and passwords. But then they took the Apple's IDs and passwords and plugged them into the Sony system. And oh, hang a second, they're exactly the same passwords they've used for their Apple ID as their work login. And suddenly then we've got Sony impacted millions of dollars, all the rest of it, all really embarrassing. And that's where we saw some of these attacks and the use of this data can be done. And when we talk about, as a small business, why like someone's email address is really important to protect, or their password login to your system, whatever it may be, is because unfortunately people are doubling up on all of this, and you can take this data and you can then use it again to try and hack into something which is a little bit more, you know, someone's banking system or whatever it is, you know, the banking app.
I think, Taz, that's a really interesting example you provide, because, you know, circling back to, you said, I think, was it 49% of breaches are human error. And I feel like that underpins coming back to policy and procedures, and not underestimating the importance of continuing to talk to staff about protocol and why you have these procedures in place, because potentially it can be avoidable, and avoidable in terms of loss of potential revenue and that impact it could cause, but also it's about reputation management as well, because like the example for Sony, a global brand, and a simple, probably a space we've got a lot of education into now is those phishing emails, but it's about constantly educating your team and your staff on what these cyber breaches or how new threats are probably really unfolding.
Yeah, absolutely. And it probably, and I'm sure we'll get into this, will probably be the biggest takeaway, I think, from today as one of the most controllable elements which anyone who's managing a business or an organization can do is staff training, is that everyone within your organization is going to have different varying levels of education around this subject. But it is about sort of bringing up the person who's maybe the least just getting it up, because it is one of those things, and we know it's so simple that someone just clicked on a link. But again, training people around that's not particularly hard, but it's also just something which just needs to be done. And we can't assume that everyone within an organization is going to know that, or is going to be all that savvy in noticing what is a real, Apple ID verification email and what's a fake one. And there can be common and telltale signs, which we can just,
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose from an operator perspective, they could be receiving emails left, right, and are receiving emails left, right, and centre for people saying, oh, they might want to book a tour or engage in their product in a various way. So really training your staff on how to vet those emails so that should come in to what are legitimate and what aren't.
Yeah.
We're talking about the breaches, and like I said, Sony was a great example. So when do you have to take those next steps? When is it notifiable in terms of a breach in case of the instance of Sony, obviously? Or even a simple sort of example for a small business operator. But at what point is it notifiable, and who do we have to notify, and what do those steps look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And notification is really important to be aware of. So for context, Uber had a breach in 2016, and they've just been subject to some penalties which have come out this year and relatively recently. And one of the biggest reasons they were subject to some, they were hit globally. So some other jurisdictions hit them financially, but Australia hit them with some increased regulatory penalties and declarations as to what they hadn't done, particularly around the reason is they didn't notify anyone. They lost about 1.2 million users' data in Australia. It was a lot more globally, and they just didn't tell anyone. They didn't notify, they didn't tell their customers. They tried. Essentially what they ended up doing is they paid the hackers about 100 grand to go away and delete, but that's not, even though you've managed to maybe mitigate, you need to tell people. So, which brings into the question, what is and isn't notifiable? So again, notification is for people who are required to comply with the Privacy Act. Again, for anyone who might be sitting here going, well, my organisation isn't generating $3 million, yet you probably may not be caught up with it. But again, be cautious about anyone you supply to and any obligations you have contractually, because that may work up the chain. You may have to tell someone that you supply information to that we've lost data, because it may impact them, and they may have to report.
Exactly.
And if you don't
and I'll just cut in there, Taz. So think about your third-party distribution channels for operators. Sorry to butt in there, but that's just an example of working up the line, and those larger organisations who definitely would fit that criteria of 3 million. Key example are your distribution channels. Absolutely,
exactly. So when do we actually have to notify? So we first identify, well, a data incident. So again, we have the example of I leave my computer on the train, that's an incident. It could be, again, I sent an email to the wrong person, or an IT person comes and tells us and says, someone's hacked our system, whatever it may be. Something has occurred, some information is lost or potentially lost. First and foremost, we look to, is there a very simple mitigation? I left my computer on the train, I call the company and say, I've left my computer, can you cover it without anyone? So again, the really immediate, simple things. I send an email to the wrong person, I immediately pick up the phone and say, hey, I've just sent you the wrong thing, can you just delete that and not look at it? It may be that everything can stop there. But the next thing is, all right, we've got to assess, and the assessment becomes really important, is go, has there been a done, or has there been potential for one? And then the assessment you have to take, is it likely to result in serious harm to anyone's information that you've lost? Serious harm sounds like quite a high threshold, and it's one which there is guidance around what that means, but it's a very fluid term in the sense that it's really case-by-case basis and you have to make an assessment. But I would essentially treat that if you've lost someone's, if you have lost someone's name, address, contact details, all these sorts of things, you're probably likely to be getting into the serious harm. Is if you have, like, let's say a client list with, look, I'd be erring on the side of caution. I suppose there are examples where it could be potentially, maybe you've got a list of names where you've got someone's first name, not their last name. Then maybe there's no serious harm that could come from it and there's no associated information. So it's something really minor, then maybe you don't. But again, I'd be erring on the side of caution. But essentially, you've got to make that assessment. They're likely to be serious harm which could come from, and that could be harm, again, so here you go, physical, mental well-being, financial loss, or damage to someone's reputation. So they're sort of the main elements of what could be serious. And you could fit any variety of different examples underneath that. Once you've made the assessment and says, look, there is a potential for serious harm, then you've got to be notifying, which then there's a process for this, and this is when you're sort of getting the lawyers in. Particularly for smaller or medium-sized businesses, that's probably where you are picking up the phones to a lawyer. Larger corporations will likely have internal compliance people who will be a little bit more familiar with making these, will be able to handle this. But then you're notifying the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, who is essentially the government authority in respect to this. There has been, which I won't go into too much details, but there can potentially be a requirement to notify the Australian Signals Directorate as well, which is essentially a national security organisation, so a spy agency. If you want to put it in that sort of sense, then probably not as exciting as the CIA or something, but there can be obligations upon certain corporations and companies to notify them as well. I won't probably go through those examples because, again, we bore a few and it may not be all that relevant. But.
So I feel like, Taz, this circles back to, what businesses can do to plan and mitigate for risk. And it comes down to training, but it also comes down to perhaps internal policies and then procedures, and drilling down into, when do we have to start telling people? When is it notifiable? If you have a policy or a procedure you've developed, you know the point of which, okay, we can assess and manage it in-house based on assessing what that risk is, but then we need to now engage the experts of the lawyer to help manage this on our behalf, because nor are you expected to be experts in this field when you're small business managers and have limited resources and wearing a number of hats in your business as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly take the last point. It's one of those things is we're expected nowadays to be just experts in absolutely everything, and it can be a little bit overwhelming. And I think this is probably where, and you've hit the nail on the head, is policies and procedures. So I tend to, and this is a lot of what my role is when I'm dealing with this subject, is putting those in place for people and businesses. Essentially, is first and foremost two documents. I'll call it data breach policy, which is essentially your outward facing to the public document. This is what you tell the world to say, here is how we manage a breach in our data. And essentially it's just comfort to everyone to know what will and won't happen. Also important for your employees to be across that one as well. Then we have what I call a data breach management plan. Now, there's a lot of materials out there again, and again, this might be one again I'll link to you as well. You can sort of circulate this. Again, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner has a lot of really helpful information as to how to manage a data breach. I personally have plans which I help people prepare, which are very much tick box plans, which will take you through something's occurred and how to assess and how to do it. So that's probably first and foremost. So when addressing whether something's happened is how to deal with it. And then third element, which I'm more and more strongly recommending, is having a privacy officer within the business. Now, it depends upon the size of your business. If you're a two-person small tourism operator, again, you're doing everything. You're wearing all hats. But I think it's important nowadays is to have someone, it's like having a first aid officer, is having someone whose job it is just to be across all of this, to be aware of the plan, how to do the plan, where are the documents, something's happened, and to be the one to hassle everyone, be in their ear about this sort of stuff, is make it someone's responsibility. And I think that's one of the big things you can do to help mitigate these things occurring, is just have it as in someone's mind a responsibility, because on a day-to-day basis, we all get caught up with other things and it gets pushed off.
And I like your analogy there, Taz. We've got the first aid officer, we've got the fire warden, we've got the health and safety.
Yeah.
This is as a risk as all those other aspects we look at it. And like I said at the beginning, it's the number one global risk to our business. So we've really got to be having framework in there to support our business and structure, to support our business. And it's a note I made before, and I think like your recommendation about having that policy, privacy officer, it's helping make that become forefront of people, your staff's minds, and a part of their language every day. And by making that one person's responsibility as well. So Taz, I'm a small business operator. It's great. I can connect with you, which is awesome, to putting together the data breach policy, a data breach management plan. And then I'm led to believe that helps guide the training that I would give to my staff. Is that correct?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
That's the next piece is, taking our staff on the journey and increasing their awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those things, it's, you're helpful to have this internal policy which says, we're going to, update our passwords every 3 months or whatever it is that you need to bring people along and educate as to why this is important. So yes, the policies can be a really helpful education tool. Probably, I suppose they're probably quite dry documents. I'm not sure if everyone's ever, whenever you start a new job, you get a folder of documents which are this thick and say you need to read every single one of these policies, and everyone should, whether they do or don't. So it might be something that, again, organisation to organisation differs as to what people do. Speaking firstly for what we do, so our Wallmans has a monthly update whereby we go through like a training provider, we get like a little video which is a bit of a quiz and just covers off that month a certain type of cybersecurity risk incident process with which you can be across. So that's probably, it's a great little training sort of programming, a little animated video. They're quite simple and straightforward. So that's one of the ways some people are approaching it, is just to give it like a proper education process. Or otherwise, it is just doing some internal training where maybe you do sit down and talk about, here's the policy, here's what we're meant to do. And then there are things like, Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, I think, releases, weekly reports or emails saying, here's the most recent scam going about, or whatever the case may be, is just pushing out those emails as to sort of, here's what spear phishing is, and these types of things. And again, organisation to organisation, different types of mechanisms can be used, but again, just having some training, I think, is really important.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that awareness. So obviously, Taz, Kathy's canoe tours is going to be my example, but obviously I've got my data breach policy in place. I've got my data breach management plan. I'm obviously, taking all the regulatory obligations that I need to be aware of in place, but I get stung. I get a cyber attack.
Yeah.
What is the first place what do I do? My systems are compromised.
Yeah.
And they're the tools that I use to run my business. Who do you call? How do I respond to it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it depends upon if it is something like your website's being taken down, or maybe someone's taken over your Facebook, get onto the IT people, probably pretty quick, smart to see about limiting the damage. That's probably your first call. Second one is we go back to a comment is essentially earlier is about, here we go. I've just got over my notes. So yeah, so the three main words here, so contain. So that's probably the first, which I was saying about there, is contain the breach. See what you can do about just stopping it. Call the IT person, whatever it needs to be. Second is then assess what has happened. What have we lost, if anything at all? And probably around that point in time, you may be thinking about picking up the phone to the lawyer to say, we think we have suffered a loss here. Do we need a report? Now, some organisations who have got the management plan in place, you'll have that plan, and you'll basically, it'll be no different to sitting down and filling out a like a injury incident report at work or something along those lines. You'll essentially just sit down with the report and run yourself through it. And it should then answer the questions, do I need to then be submitting, either letting people know, so letting your customers, clients know something's happened, and there's a variety of different ways to go about doing that. And then B, do I need to be getting on to the more formal reporting obligations?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that sort of, I feel like we've got into a lot of detail there, Taz, but there's some real good tangible takeaways. And one of mine, if I can reflect, is we need to be managing our approach to cyber and data protection as it is the number one risk to businesses, the same as we manage our other risks around occupational health and safety, fire, first aid. It's a shift in our mindsets on how we manage cyber, albeit it's a challenging risk because it's non-tangible. A lot of this cyber stuff, and admittedly, I know for my side of things, it's rapidly evolving. So to keep your head across it, it's a challenging space. Yeah. But that's where we've got like the experts of like yourself to help give us the tools and the framework to do that. Guys, I appreciate everybody listening to me talk and Taz talk, but it's really an opportunity for you too. Does anybody have any questions? You can use the put your hand up function and simply, or take yourself off mic. But I want to open this to the floor of people. If you have any questions, feel free to fire away to Taz in this moment. Oh, hi, Elise. Perfect. Good work putting your hand up.
Instead of putting my hand up.
I love it. Take yourself off. Obviously, you're off mic. Fire away, Elise.
Yeah, thanks for that, Taz. I was just wondering, so I'm a very small business, definitely not making 3 million, one person, so I don't have a team to get across these things. And I use LastPass password software, but then I've got these third-party platforms like MailChimp and Resdy and SmartWaver that have got my customers' data. So apart from keeping my LastPass password software up to date and making sure the passwords are long and complex and different, is there anything I should be doing to make sure that those third parties are, I'm sure that they're all across it? Is there anything I need to be worried about?
Yeah, that's a really, I think, well, I think a point, good question is making sure the people you work with are really reputable, and checking up on them is doing a little bit of, because you're quite right, is you're a little bit in their hands, is that they're a service that you need to use. You're handing over your client's information to them to provide it. So making sure and checking them and what they do and make sure they're reputable. Probably not necessarily applicable to you, but we are seeing increasingly in certain industries is that essentially data can't be going offshore, which is becoming a massive issue, is is data security in regards to you're providing information to someone else. Where are they storing that? Are they storing it in the United States or in Europe, which is fantastic, or are they storing it in some sort of server out of Russia, which would be far, and particularly in the current climate, and it does happen, Russia or China, really undesirable. So probably from a small business perspective there's a little bit of, and this would be sort of on your website when someone signs up to your service, is your terms and conditions, is having a section in there to say, we do use other providers, we do use MailChimp, whoever it is, your data will be transferred to them. Can you please approve this? Because the issue which probably you face is that, okay, yes, a data incident happens, that's out of your control, that's on them, but do you carry liability to your customer for that? And where you might carry liability is they go, I never approved you to give that information over to third parties. So that's where your terms and conditions are really important. And this is where, so I suppose the lawyers come into a little bit more to play. It's not about stopping an incident from happening. It's about how can I save your business from being sued? And that's where, making sure your clients have approved third-party providers being receiving their information, and that then again, hopefully, to the extent with which you can, shifts liability.
I I think that's a great example and great question, Elise, and some really good tangible advice, Taz, probably applicable to everybody on the call, going back and having a look at your terms and conditions, because majority of tourism operators are using a third party plugin like a MailChimp or a Resdi. It could be property management systems or third party distribution channels as well. So in terms of protecting yourself around having a really tight and transparent and comprehensive terms and conditions. Kate, did you want to come off mic? I see you've popped a question up. Did you want to unmute yourself?
Yep,
or
sure.
would you... Perfect. How are you going, Kate?
Yeah, good, thank you.
That's good. Over to yourself, Kate. I'll have a chat to Taz about your question. That's a really, really good one.
So I've looked into it a bit, and we don't have a privacy policy at the moment. Just, yeah, trying to get a template for it. And, you know, obviously you might need to change it for your own your situation. But yeah, it doesn't seem to be something last time I looked that was readily available.
What would be Kate's first point of call? She doesn't have a privacy policy and that sort of data management policy. What would you recommend her to do? Is it engaging with yourself first, or is there some resources she could use to help build those foundations for her?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the simple answer is always going to be, and I'm always going to say, the lawyer, is yes, engage with a lawyer, particularly on those policy sides of things. I do appreciate that lawyers are expensive, not the most fun people to contact, and that we, and particularly for smaller operators, the compliance level is not necessarily huge. It is just some basic stuff about, just seek approval with respect to what you can and can't do with data, put some basic policies in place. So it doesn't need to be, something, like what when you click on I agree with, when you sign up to your Apple terms and conditions, which is some, huge document which will take you hours to read. So probably, and again, we'll link is the sort of the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner will give some guidance in this regard. I suspect there probably are some online privacy policies which you can probably utilise. Potentially when you, it's been a while since I've set up my own website, but I did do one or help someone a couple of years back. And sometimes when some of the standard websites who help you construct them and host them can sometimes have recommended policies. So that might be something to check up on, is to sort of, because again, I suppose when I say website, so much of today's business is done through your website. So that's just, and usually where most people host their privacy policies. And when even if they have someone come into their business, you're probably directing them to your website to go and find things like privacy policy. Finally, if you do, and again, I'm not recommending it because I can't recommend it, if you are going to just go and see what other people are doing and clicking on the little tab at the bottom of someone else's website which says privacy policy and going Control-C and pasting it to yourself, not that I'm recommending that, but I understand, is just to be cautious around making sure it's Australia relevant. A lot of stuff comes out from the United States and a lot of stuff comes out from Europe. It's not necessarily quite relevant to what we're doing here. So I'll just bear that in mind, and also just copyright infringement, which technically that's what that is. And can be a little bit embarrassing, particularly if you don't change names and so forth. So again, not recommending that. It's a bit like Googling your own symptoms when you go to the doctor. It likely come up with the right example, but I do understand that these things do occur. So just those basics.
But also, Taz, to put it into perspective, like you said, usually for a small business, it's not a comprehensive task, and for all of our people on our call today, and all TICSA members, you're actually entitled to a free 15-minute telephone advice with Wallmans. So make the most of that 15 minutes when you're a small business, and like Taz said, there's not perhaps a lot, and then you've got the expertise of some advice on the line. It might actually not be as big of an expense as potentially we think it might be, but what it's worth in the long run, highly valuable in saving bigger expenses on the flip side as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point is, and particularly in that 15 minutes, what we can probably assess is what do you need to be doing? What to what extent do we have to go with your business? Look, is it just something really simple or is it something more complex? And that sometimes, so the big question is I know I'm meant to do something, but what is that something?
Yeah.
And to what extent? And that's something which we can really get a grasp of within that short period of time.
Yeah, exactly. Making use of, you're the expert on the phone. So I would really encourage our members to make the most of that, and we can put details on the email that will come out. Furthermore, we'll also put, like Taz said, he's going to share some of those resources with me. And so you've got some points of information to refer to just to start to further build your knowledge in this area. So just before we wrap up today, because I'm conscious that time flicks away pretty quickly on these sessions, 3 takeaways, Taz, from today. What are the 3 priorities we should really be recommending from your perspective? I feel like I've already got them, but what are the must-dos people should be walking away and making a priority to be looking at if they're doing in their business after today's session?
Absolutely. I don't think any of this is going to be massively surprising from probably what the conversation, but so 3 are sort of, I think the main focus is just to review your policies and procedures and what you have in place now. Just go and have a check, whether it is just going onto your website and clicking on the little link at the bottom, which may say privacy policy or terms and conditions. Check what you got. Check your compliance obligations. So as we talked about, if you are a supplier to someone, what are your privacy obligations or cybersecurity obligations under that? So just a real review, not something that may take 10, 15, 20 minutes. It doesn't have to be huge. Just find out where you are at the moment and what may need to be done. Number 2, I think as we talked about, human error is probably one of the biggest contributor to breaches and errors in this space. And so is this that education? I think that's the most important thing. One, for yourself, there's a heap of resources out there nowadays coming from the government as well as private organisations about cybersecurity, how these things occur. Is just looking into that and guess we all need it. We're all learning. It's something which we're all doing, and so we've just got to keep up on top of that. And probably the last one, maybe a bit of a joke, is install the latest iOS update, whatever that ticks on your phone. Probably what they usually tell you right at the front is that they've got all these great features. What they aren't telling you is that those ISO updates are actually plugging gaps where they've found leaks. So they're really important. Is keeping your systems updated, and one of the most simple things, which I know I'm sometimes bad about.
Yeah, I love that, because don't ignore them, because I think we've all been, we've all fallen victim to, I don't have time to do this. What's this bloody reminder about, or this notification? But yeah, keeping our systems updated, that's a really good one. Well, thank you, Taz. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to share with our community some insights and how to continue fostering, developing their business in this area. I know I've certainly got some great takeaways. So even applies to TIC-SA, like it's constant, continual education, no matter what business you're doing. And Taz, you even shared what Wallmans Lawyers are doing internally for your staff as well. Today, like I said, we'll be sharing this session via an email with you all. We've got, along with the resources and some call to reference to contact Taz or anybody else in the team, and utilise that 15 minutes with an expert partner and expert advice. 15 minutes you haven't used elsewhere, so you'd probably get some really good tangible takeaways from that. I hope everybody else has enjoyed this session. Thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. See you.
Thank you.